Joe sat at the blackjack table, eyes scanning the players around him. His gaze landed on the dealer. Her mind was like a brightly burning flame, and Joe was drawn to it like a moth. He was drawn to her thoughts, her memories, her desires. With a deep breath, he reached out with his mind, connecting with hers. As he looked down at his hand of cards, he could see everything that she saw, think everything she thought. Her thoughts were focused on picking up some groceries after work. "Come on, girl, mind on the game," he thought to himself. He looked at his hand, counting cards with ease as he searched for the tethers to the minds of the players sitting next to him. It amazed him how simple the human mind was. They never seemed to notice him in there. But as he won another hand, someone else noticed him in the flesh. A man in a crisp tan suit put his finger to his ear. He quickly scooped up his chips and withdrew his mind back into himself. With a final nod to the dealer and the other players, he turned and walked towards the casino exit. His heart raced as he felt the man's mind following him, suspicious and wary. Joe focused on the man's mind, but this one was harder to connect with. The light was dim. With a surge of concentration, he planted a suggestion in the man's mind. Vague sense of boredom and apathy towards Joe's presence. The man's mind shifted, his attention diverted, and Joe slipped out of the casino undetected. As he walked away, he felt a rush of excitement and satisfaction at his successful escape. The thrill of the game and the rush of adrenaline pumping through his veins made him feel alive. But Joe's excitement quickly passed as he froze as he saw a black car slow down in front of him. He watched as the car came to a stop, the engine cutting out with a final groan. Two men stepped out of the car, their crisp black suit blazers and ties giving them an air of authority as they strode purposefully in Joe's direction. He could feel the weight of their gaze on him, could sense the tension in their movements. It was clear that they were not here for a friendly chat. Joe swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. He turned his head, pretending not to notice them, and tried to walk casually, hoping to blend in with the crowd. But the men had already spotted him. They moved quickly, their expressions grim and determined, and before he knew it, he was surrounded. "Joe Martin, you're under arrest," one of the men said, his voice firm and commanding. Joe stopped in his tracks, feeling a shiver run down his spine. He had always thought that he was taking a risk by cheating at gambling, but he never thought he would get caught. Was what he was doing even a crime? There were no laws on telepathy, and no one could possibly know he was doing it anyway. The two imposing men escorted him to the car. Joe tried to connect with their minds, as he had done with so many others in the past, but to his surprise he couldn't get through. It was as if they had erected a mental barrier around themselves, preventing him from accessing their thoughts. He felt a sense of unease creeping over him. This had never happened before, not since he had mastered his telepathy years ago. He wondered how the agents had managed to shield their minds from him, and what other surprises they might have in store for him. They sat him in the back of the car, and the man in the front passenger seat turned to face him. "I'm Agent Harris, and this is Agent Smith. Joe, we know about your telepathy," he said, his tone serious. "We know about your little gambling habit. You're facing some serious charges, but we're willing to make a deal." Joe raised an eyebrow. "Counting cards is not a crime, but insider trading is," Harris replied. Joe felt a heavy, foreboding sensation settle in his gut like a lead weight. The mere thought of being under surveillance made him break out in a cold sweat. How long had they been watching him? He couldn't shake the feeling that every move he made was being scrutinized, every conversation monitored. Insider trading had been one of the first things Joe had experimented with after discovering his telepathic abilities. The thrill of knowing the inner workings of a company before anyone else was tempting, but the risk was too great. The fear of being caught and the potential consequences had forced him to abandon the idea. But now the mere suggestion that he was being watched for this very reason made his mind race with possibilities. How much did they know? Had he slipped up and given himself away? The weight in his stomach grew heavier with each passing thought. "What kind of deal?" Joe asked. "We need help with the case," Harris said. "There's a person of interest who's been refusing to talk to us, and we think you might be able to get through to them. If you agree to help us out, we'll let you go free. Otherwise, you're looking at a long stay in prison." Joe considered the offer for a moment. He knew he had little choice but to accept. "Okay," he finally said. "I'll help you out, but you have to promise me that I won't face any other charges." Harris nodded. "You have our word," he said. Joe released a deep, heavy sigh, his body sinking back into the soft leather of the car seat. Relief washed over him as he realized he had narrowly avoided being thrown in jail, but it was quickly replaced by apprehension as he thought about the predicament he found himself in. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head and had taken on more than he could handle. As the car sped down the highway, Joe couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had agreed to talk to someone he knew nothing about, and the thought made his stomach turn. They drove for what felt like hours, winding down roads that grew increasingly remote, until they finally arrived at a compound tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The agents led Joe inside the complex, down a long hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were bare concrete, and the only sound was the echo of their footsteps on the floor. Eventually, they arrived at a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor. One of the agents swiped a card, and the door slid open with a hiss. They gestured for Joe to step inside, and he found himself in a dimly lit room with a single chair and a window that looked out into a pitch-black void. Joe couldn't see anything beyond the glass. The effect was dizzying. He took a seat in the chair, trying to suppress the feeling of anxiety that was welling up inside him. The agents stood on either side of him, their expressions unreadable. What is this place?" he asked, unable to keep the tremble out of his voice. The agents remained silent, and Joe's apprehension grew. He couldn't help but wonder what kind of people he was dealing with. Finally, one of the agents spoke up. "Do your thing. You are going to translate for me," he said in a monotone voice. "What? There's nobody here," Joe replied. "Behind the glass. Tell me when you've connected with him." Joe exhaled slowly, feeling the air pass from his lungs, through his throat and out his mouth. It left his body and joined the greater collective that we all breathe, ever present and swirling around us. As he felt the breath leave his chest and drift out into the open world, so too did his mind diffuse out into the vastness that existed beyond the physical. He stretched out, grasping beyond the black window, and that was when it happened. The blackjack dealer's flame was nothing compared to this. This was more like the sun, and he wasn't just drawn to it, he was pulled in. It was as though, for the first time, he was the small fish swimming alongside the whale. He'd done this 1,000 times before, but never had a mind felt so inhuman. "So what is he saying?" Harris's question snapped Joe back to reality. He had been so absorbed in his connection that he had momentarily forgotten about his surroundings. Joe cleared his throat, trying to push aside the uneasiness that was creeping up on him. We haven't started yet," he stammered, feeling the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Joe took a deep breath and closed his eyes, centering himself, and began to speak in a calm and steady voice. "Hello, I'm Joe." There was a few seconds of silence, and Joe prepared to say, "I'm connected, but he," when a voice boomed through his head like it came from a giant speaker. "Hello." Joe's heart raced at the sound of the voice. It was deep and resonant, like the rumble of thunder on a stormy night. He struggled to keep his composure as he relayed the message to Harris. "He says, 'Hello,'" Joe informed Harris, trying to keep his voice steady. Joe focused his attention back on the connection. "What is your name?" he asked. "I do not have a name," the voice replied. Joe couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. This was unlike any communication he had ever experienced before. The voice was not human. and he wasn't sure if he was even communicating with the living being. "Ask him how he got here," Agent Harris commanded. Joe took a deep breath before asking, "Well, can you tell me how you got here?" "The agents brought me here." "I think he means, where are you from?" Joe asked. "Ask him, are there more like him?" Agent Harris interjected. "Slow down, this takes a while," Joe said to Harris, feeling overwhelmed. He turned his attention back to the connection. "Are there more like you?" he asked. "You are like me," the voice replied. "Let me ask you, why are you speaking in words? It is slow, it is bulky and inefficient. I understand this is how you communicate with them, but we have no need for this, and you have no need to ask me questions. You have all the answers you want at any time." Joe was taken aback by the response. He focused his mind on the origin of the voice, and in an instant he saw a distant star rush towards him. And once the star was closer, he saw a green planet approach him. Joe felt a jolt of excitement as he realized the implications of what he had just seen. "He's from another planet," Joe said to Harris. "I'm not sure what it's called, but if I had a star map, I could point it out." Joe focused his attention back on the creature, trying to determine what species it belonged to. In his mind's eye, he saw a bunch of small, gray-skinned humanoids, and he knew that he was dealing with something that was beyond anything he possibly could have imagined. Joe focused on the creature's mind, feeling his own consciousness expanding and expanding. He could feel the creature's thoughts flowing through his mind like a river, its abstract concepts and ideas forming and dissolving in a never-ending cycle. He tried to make sense of what he was experiencing, but the more he tried, the more elusive it became. "Joe, what is it saying?" Agent Harris asked impatiently. Joe struggled to find the words to describe what he was experiencing. "It's like trying to describe the taste of a color," he said, his voice barely audible. "What does that even mean?" Harris exclaimed. Joe tried to focus on the creature's message, but the more he tried, the more it slipped away from him. He could sense the creature's frustration at his inability to understand, and he felt a pang of guilt. "I'm sorry, I'm trying to understand," he thought to the creature. "But your thoughts, they're so different from anything I've experienced before." The creature's response was a jumble of abstract concepts, colors, shapes, and emotions that Joe struggled to make sense of. He could feel his mind expanding and contracting with each passing moment, trying to keep up with the creature's endless stream of consciousness. "It's like trying to catch a butterfly with your bare hands," Joe said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The more you try, the further it flies away." Harris looked at Joe, puzzled. "What the hell are you talking about?" I don't know," Joe admitted, feeling his mind slipping further and further away from reality. I think I need a break." Harris continued to fire questions at Joe. The telepathic connection between him and the alien intensified. Joe's mind was expanding, and with each passing moment, the communication became more abstract and difficult to comprehend. He clutched his head and tried to make sense of the incomprehensible barrage of information bombarding his brain. "What is the purpose of your visit to Earth?" Harris demanded. Joe slumped over, his forehead pressed against the black glass. He desperately tried to reach the alien through words, but his mind was too scattered to form coherent sentences. Harris wasn't satisfied. "Tell us about your technology," he pressed. "What kinds of weapons you have? What are your capabilities?" "Please, stop, I can't take this," Joe pleaded. "Tell us about your technology," Harris boomed, his voice penetrating Joe's mind. But the alien's response was not what Joe expected. In a soft tone Joe heard in his mind, "You know they won't let you leave now. You know everything I know." Joe's heart sank. He knew the implications of the alien's words. He had become a liability, a witness who knew too much, and he also knew the government agents would never let him leave the room alive. Panicking, Joe tried to sever the telepathic connection, but he couldn't. The information was flowing both ways now, and he couldn't stop. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I can't shut it off. As Joe struggled to regain control of his thoughts, Agent Smith slammed his hand against a button on the wall. The black glass that separated Joe from the alien entity suddenly turned into a mirror, revealing Joe's frightened face. He fell to the floor, gasping for breath, as the psychic connection instantly dissolved. The room was silent, except for the sound of his ragged breathing. As the psychic link was severed, Joe felt a rush of relief flood through him. His mind was his own again, free from the chaotic jumble of thoughts and emotions that had bombarded him moments ago. But that sense of relief was short-lived, and quickly gave way to a feeling of profound isolation. Joe had been plunged into a world of telepathy and mind-reading, a place where the boundaries between his thoughts and those of others had become blurred and indistinct. Now, with the link severed, he felt the weight of that isolation bear down on him, like a physical force. He was alone, trapped in his own head, and he knew that this was his new reality, unless he could find a way to escape. Is that it? I've got work in the morning, Joe asked the agents, his voice slow and tired. Harris gave him a stern look. This is not the end, Joe. We need to debrief you and assess the situation. Joe's heart sank. He didn't want to spend the rest of his life as a test subject, or worse, as some kind of prisoner. He needed to find a way out of this, but his mind was foggy and he couldn't think clearly. We'll be out of here in no time, Harris said, provided you tell us everything you've learned from this creature. Agent Smith extended his hand to help Joe from the floor, but Joe didn't want to take it. He pushed himself up and stumbled, his legs still shaky from the intense telepathic connection. Agent Smith guided him towards the door, and Joe stumbled again, almost falling. He felt completely disoriented, unable to process the flood of information that had overwhelmed him. As they walked out of the room, Joe could feel the weight of Harris's words settling on him. How could he possibly tell them everything he had learned from this creature? His mind was a jumbled mess, filled with strange images and concepts that he couldn't even begin to put into words. It was as if he had absorbed a new language, one that he couldn't speak yet. As Joe and Smith left the room, Harris pressed a button on the intercom. Subject 14 is heading to medical. We may have what we need this time, he said, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more of the story, please let me know in the comments.